Oh, hello. Hi, come on. George is normally here, but Zara's gracing us with her presence, which is lovely. She's a very sweet dog. She's a little bit shy. So we have both greyhounds. Anyway, it's nice to have them. Oh, she's a very cuddly girl, aren't you? Yes. Now we want to look at some books, Zara, so we've got to be a bit careful. And go on. Anyway, I'm glad you've come here. We're just in the week running up to Pentecost, the great feast of the church, which is all about, among other things, the gift of translation, the gift of tongues, of hearing in many languages. And around this time, I always go to a particular book, well, in fact, around all the great festivities, which is on the shelf here. I told you that these ones are precious because of personal association or antiquity, or both. Well, now we're going to take down, I think, possibly the largest book in my library. Not quite, but nearly the oldest. It's a magnificent, weighty, beautiful 17th century folio. But it is precious for many more reasons than just antiquity or binding. Do come over here and have a little look. You can navigate between the two dogs. So this is a folio volume. I don't know if you can just see there. It says 96 Sermons, Andrews. So this is the great Lancelot Andrews, who was, as they said in those days, the stella predicantium, the great star of the preaching of the pulpit of the late 16th and early 17th century. He was a preacher pretty much contemporary with Shakespeare, preached to the court of King James. And this is a collection of his sermons, the 96 Sermons. It's got a wonderful frontispiece, you'll see. There's the great man himself, Lancelot Andrews. And this was, Andrews died in 1626, I think, but this is, as you can see, 1641. There was a less full edition in 1635. 96 sermons. Now, astonishing to have this. I studied Lancelot Andrews and John Donne's sermons as part of my PhD and the way they influenced T.S. Eliot. And in fact, were you to read through these sermons, you'd find, like, there's a Christmas sermon about the journey of the Magi, which says, goes, a cold coming they had of it, the very worst time of year, the weather, the ways rough, the weather deep. So, you know, Eliot found plenty of good stuff in here. But I particularly, as we're coming up to Pentecost, I wanted to share with you, if I might from here, I think I've marked the passages because it's that season of the year. I wanted to share with you just a couple of things. We've got the sermons he preached on the Feast of Pentecost, and we've got a run right through from he was obviously a great preacher, but the important thing to grasp about him is that when in the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, the King James, decided that there should be a project to make a new translation of the Bible, Lancelot Andrews, the Dean of Westminster, was the guy in charge of it, and he had general oversight of the translation of what became the King James Version. So once, when I was having to write a chapter about that for a celebration, and 2011 was the anniversary of the 1611, I thought it'd be interesting to go back to Andrews's sermons and look at what he'd said at Pentecost, because it's all about language and translation, and people could hear it. And I kind of drew out of those sermons a sort of theology of translation. But I just want to show you a couple of great bits. So this is the first of his sermons that we have on the Feast of Pentecost. And right at the beginning, he celebrates what you might call diversity in language. He says, one of the great and wonderful benefits of God, indeed a benefit so great and so wonderful, as there were not tongues enough on earth to celebrate it withal, but there were fain to be more sent from heaven to help to sound it out thoroughly, even a supply of tongues from heaven, for all the tongues in earth were not sufficient to magnify God for his goodness in sending down to men the gift of the Holy Ghost. This is fantastic. What he's saying is, tongues here doesn't mean just the tongue that you're speaking with. It means tongues in the sense of languages. So it's very much plural, polyglot, diverse. It's saying we don't need fewer languages, we need more languages to understand who God is. And later on, in another sermon, this is the second of his sermons of the sending of the Holy Ghost, he has this wonderful passage where he talks about how, in a curious way, the Feast of Pentecost, when all these people from all these different places speaking these different languages suddenly were able to hear in their own mother tongue the gospel, and where there might have been a confusion of tongues, there was an understanding. The church fathers had often said, well, this is a bit like a kind of a reversal of the story of the Tower of Babel, where they all speak one language and then they're divided. But here they all speak these different languages and they're united. But Andrews says, no, it's better. In Babel, the many languages are a curse. But actually in Pentecost, the very fact that there are so many ways of saying the same thing becomes a blessing. Let's just see if we can find a bit of this. So he says, indeed, it was not meet one tongue only should be employed that way, as before, but one was. It was too poor and slender, like the music of a monochord. Far more meet was it that many tongues, yea, that all tongues should do it. And of course he's riffing on the bit of, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, which as a consort of many instruments might yield a full harmony, in which we behold the mighty work of God, that the same means of diverse tongues, which was the destroying of Babel, the very same is there made to be the work of the building of Zions, that means that scattered them from the tower of confusion, the very same to reduce them to the fold of unity, that so the curse might be taken away. And when Andrews himself was translating from the Hebrew and from Greek into English, he used the full diversity of the ways that English itself could be used. There's a wonderful richness and variety even within the one language, English, of the many tongues out of which English is itself devised. So he uses Latinate words and French words and Anglo-Saxon words, and he gives you the full range. And of course, Shakespeare was doing too. I mean, he and Shakespeare probably knew each other. We can't be certain, but they were both court officials. Shakespeare was in the King's Player and he was the King's Preacher. And they had the big Whitsun festivals and the big plays at the same time. So they probably were hanging around backstage together, as it were. And Shakespeare, of course, let's come over here now. Just before we do, I must show you one more thing about this book. I mean, you may wonder how it is that I came to have this extraordinary book, because certainly when I was a student studying Andrews, I couldn't possibly have afforded this. I knew these books existed, but these rare 17th century folios. Well, there's a great American scholar. She's a biblical scholar, as Andrews was, a great expert on the Old Testament, but also somebody who's passionate about the 17th century, called Ellen Davies, and she became a friend of mine, and I would visit her at Duke University. And she had this book on her shelf, and one day she sat me down and she told me about it. And the book was given to her by Brevard Childs, the great Old Testament scholar who wrote The Living World of the Old Testament, and who gave it to Ellen because she had been such a great student of his. So Brevard Childs write, Ellen, with deep appreciation and warmest regards. Bard, there we are, March 1996. And then, one day, as she was retiring and downstairs, she took this book off her shelf, she put it in my hands, and then we opened it, and she wrote, given to Malcolm Guy, 25th of September 2014, the feast day of Lancelot Andrews, with affection and prayer for his ministry of writing and preaching. Ellen F. Daisies. And you can imagine the joy with which I received this, but also the sense that this book has outlasted Brevard Childs, one generation, and Ellen Davies and me, and will outlast me, and eventually I'll find some young scholar who knows what this is all about, and I'll surprise him or her one evening and take this book off my shelves and write another dedication in it and pass it on. Anyway, come and have a seat for a minute. I can't forbear, I can't forbear just to finish by, apart from having a glass, I wrote a sonnet about Pentecost, which was partly inspired, as many of the things that I write, by Andrews in the sense of translation. And maybe I can just finish by reading you this, as we're in the feast and season of Pentecost. Pentecost. Today we feel the wind beneath our wings. Today the hidden fountain flows and plays. Today the church draws breath at last and sings as every flame becomes a tongue of praise. This is the feast of fire, air and water, poured out and breathed and kindled into earth. The earth herself awakens to her maker, translated out of death and into birth. The right words come today in their right order, and every word spells freedom and release. Today, the gospel crosses every border. All tongues are loosened by the Prince of Peace. Today, the lost are found in his translation, whose mother tongue is love in every nation. Anyway, thanks for dropping around.